Hello, and welcome to Working on a Dime, a role playing chat show where I hang out with some awesome creators and talk about our work. I'm Brian, and I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the founder of Dungeons on a Dime, a publishing imprint creating entry level tabletop role playing game content. My book, In the Red, is just out in bookshops internationally from the 19th of November, and I am currently celebrating the fact that I am over 200% funded on my Kickstarter Vice and Virtue. That ends on the 5th of December, and it is a cool system neutral tabletop role playing game that you can bolt on anywhere, and it's all about telling stories with fortunes. Today, I am joined by the incredible Adam Vass of World Champion Games Co. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, my name is Adam Vass. I live in California. I use he, they pronouns. And as you mentioned, I am the person behind World Champ Game Co. I designed and published games like Cobwebs, which is a conspiracy horror GM-less game. I most recently kickstarted and I'm about to fulfill my science fantasy game Necronautilus, about the universe that you go after you die and rediscovering who you are through memories and the subjectivity of reality.
Just some small things.
You know,
Just nothing major. They
it's
were
a
some very
casual
incredibly successful
philosophical.
Kickstarters as well.
Yeah, to my surprise and relief, because I'm uh, more usually a touring musician, and as everyone knows, that is not not a thing in current day. So games have become they've always been something I've enjoyed making and releasing, but now they are also my fundamental source of income.
It's really interesting that you've got two or more because you're also a freelance designer and illustrator, if I'm not mistaken.
Right? Yeah, they all kind of feed one another.
Yeah, but they're all got their separate audiences that then overlap, and it's really incredible that you like coronavirus comes along and you're able to then work in tabletop role playing games alongside your music career, and they won't overtake each other. They're just sort of different times, different places, and just as cool as each other.
Yeah, it's a huge relief because I went through the initial anxiety that sort of everyone it did, and many people still are, of just like, what do I do now?
Mm.
Um, and being stationary is a very new experience for me. Usually, I'm on the road for 6 to 10 months every year, so I think I've adapted fairly well,
That is
relatively.
a long time to be away from. I'd say like home. I guess home is wherever you want to call it, but
Yeah.
would you spend like those 10 months thinking about games, writing and testing? Would you be like only those 2 months when you come home and are as stationary as writing, or how's your workflow normally?
So I've toured since 2007, and I've only been making games since 2017. So it is a new learned skill and behavior and ritual for me. But I did, once I started getting into writing and developing games, spend quite a lot of time on the bus, like in the back of the tour bus, writing, setting stuff, or I would do a lot of layout and stuff. I would always travel too with a graphics tablet, so I was able to do illustration while I
Mm.
was touring, and I illustrate most of my own games. So uh, I did manage to find make time, I guess, to continue making games while touring. And just last year, after I did my first Kickstarter for a compilation zine called "Wish You Were Here," I had scheduled it so that all the writing would be done before the tour began, and then on the tour, I would allot time after sound check every day to work on the illustration and layout, and then order the print copies with 3 or 4 shows left on the tour so that the copies would arrive the day after I got home from tour and I could start fulfillment. Um, so really, just became two full-time jobs that were happening at the same time.
Well, I hope you didn't feel like you were burning out. I think because you've been doing mail zines for at least the last couple of years
Yeah.
as
Um,
part of your Patreon
I
rewards. How did those work out when you're traveling so much?
well, uh, it can be difficult for sure, and I think When I started my Patreon and started doing physical rewards, they were zines that I was printing and stapling and everything at home, or they were postcards, which were just 4x6 inch illustration on the front, rules text on the back that I could just throw a stamp on and drop it in the mailbox. So they were um, not they were easier to release. But the Patreon has really evolved into this creature of its own that I release a game every month in print, and I fulfill now to about 60 people every month. So I have those spinning plates just going all the time. A lot of the time, I'm thinking logistically about them and planning a couple months ahead. I'll print 2 months games at the same time and then just ship them a month apart. Or last year when I was touring, it was much less. As we've gotten older, we just do fewer, or the gaps in between are longer. So I never missed a month in, I think, 3 years now that I've done monthly physical releases through Patreon. Yeah. You mentioned burning out. I definitely feel it sometimes, but I just have to keep going. And it's in those rare moments where I'm not pedaling that I feel the muscles burning, like as soon as I take a break, that's when it kind of rushes into me that I need a break.
Yeah, it's sort of like when you lose that momentum, your body's like, okay, and now you sleep for 2 weeks. Yeah, right. I understand that.
Right. But I haven't had a lot of those opportunities in like a year.
Originally, this wasn't meant to be an interview. It's just so fascinating, all the stuff you do. I
find that happens a lot when people find out that my other life is also creative and strange. Because most game publishers, it's not our full-time work, and but it is usually supplemented by a more typical or more standard career path. So I think, that's very interesting and appealing for people in games to learn more about alternative career paths or creative stuff. In game design, but they harmonize well.
Something that just came to mind with the little zines you've been kind of like the monthly games from your Patreon as opposed to these larger projects like Necronautilus, is just the interesting formats you do, because you've got like newsprint games that are the size of a broadsheet and they're posters, which are really cool. And it was just reminding me of a talk I was listening in on Rowan Rook and Deckard, who were part of a panel on TTRPG branding for Metatopia this year, and they were saying they think they had the first t-shirt game where they had Honey Heist printed on a t-shirt, and then the GM rules were upside down on the bottom, so the GM could like lift it up and look at the rules, but you couldn't necessarily read them if you were a player. And I just think it's going to be interesting to see all the different print formats that you're going to be playing with in the future as well.
Yeah, I actually just released the first cloth face mask game. I'm very confident that I'm the only person who's done this. But the rules of the game and an illustration and like my byline and my website URL just all on a face mask that you can wear if you go outside during quarantine.
It's just plain and simple. I love it. So I think we will move on to what we're actually here to talk about, which is also really cool, which is the theme of the whole episode, I guess, whatever it is, which is anticipation, building suspense in tabletop role-playing games. I feel that I know that I really love suspense in games. Well, I mean, in all role-playing games, it's good to have an element of that narrative arc, the drama building, and then the payoff. But especially with your systems and with games that I like to play, suspense is so key to keeping the players tense, but not too tense, keeping it interesting and involved and high stakes without it being too stressful or draining. And I just wanted to have a chat with you about making suspense, building suspense. What is it, and all the different facets around that. So I thought we'd just start with, what is suspense in terms of ratcheting up tension, tabletop role playing games, that sort of thing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So obviously, I was thinking a lot about this before we began our conversation today too, and uh, even just honing in on when we were brainstorming topics and we talked about horror, and I've been publishing and writing a lot of horror games this year and engaging more, I think, than normal with horror movies and media. Um, that's sort of my go-to, but obviously that is not the sole source of suspense or anticipation in story arcs, and it's also in itself not it is an umbrella term, and there are so many different kinds of horror, and within each of those different means of achieving and approaching suspense. Um, so I use horror as this really broad umbrella term, but I think a lot of the things are sort of transferable within these subgenres of horror. A thing that I think is really important and interesting in the way that media such as movies and especially video games or tabletop games approach suspense is the idea of control and autonomy of a character. So how much they are responsible for the things that happen to them, or potentially not responsible. Maybe if someone else is doing something to them, like so in a slasher film, there is the lack of control in that someone like Jason is has a more perfect knowledge of the situation than the victims do. So the idea that they cannot just do anything they want, they are not in complete control. That loss of a degree of autonomy is something that in movies and stuff works really well. You see the characters kind of react instead of being able to just act. Um, but it's a lot harder to pull off in tabletop because, as we all know, no player likes not having options removed from their itinerary of things they want to do, especially like controlling a player character as a game master and saying this is what's happening to you and not giving them the opportunity to act on their own. So it's autonomy and control of character, I think, is a really interesting facet of suspense that I'm interested to hear what you think of how that can work or maybe should work in tabletop world, in tabletop gaming.
In tabletop land.
Yes.
When you said horror and you mentioned Jason and Control, that immediately made me think of the Alien franchise and Ripley. Ripley is sort of, in the anecdote, the player, so to speak. You start powerful, right. You start with knowledge, you're scientists, it's base, you're doing things, you're discovering things. And that's very agency focused. And then once the aliens get out, everything starts going harebrained and it's messy and it's scary because you lose control. And then you have occasional moments such as Ripley finding a flamethrower and fighting back, where you have this sort of yes moment where suddenly you have gained control again. And there's this tension and the anticipation where you know that you can lose agency. You know that Ripley has lost agency, these aliens are very powerful, and then it switches a touch where you gain that power again, but you could lose it at any moment. And I feel that anticipation is all about understanding the stakes and making measured like gambles, guesses, because that's what role-playing is to an aspect. It's determined by the dice, it's totally random. So when you want to build anticipation, you want to have established all the stakes, all the things that could be lost, and then let the players have the choice to try and get something, but ultimately they could lose it. I also feel that some of the payoff behind anticipation is in the joy of losing, almost, where the story will be entertaining if you win or if you lose, if you succeed at what you're doing or if you lose more agency, lose more power, but you're just tense about which direction it could go in.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I also think that segues really well into another thing I wanted to talk about, which is using safety tools in suspenseful games, because I think there is with all role playing games, there's just an innate level of player buy-in, and I think with traditional fantasy stuff, that buy-in is much lower. A lot of the expectation is the game master is really carrying the weight on their shoulders, and the players just sort of get to engage with the things that they are most excited to engage with, which is generally combat and like revelry. Um,
Mm.
but when you get into a lot of more indie stuff, and especially horror stuff, um, that onus of responsibility is less on the game master. It's more shared by everyone, and because of that, every player and every person involved needs to know what they're signing up for at the start, and have systems in place to protect them from harmful content, especially again with horror, where you get into um, things that obviously people actually are afraid of. Like fear is such a really interesting topic, and um, everyone is afraid of things rational and irrational, and those things carry over when you're talking about it in fiction very easily. Uh, so having things, so for example, I think a couple tools that I really like to use that generally improve my horror game play sessions. Um, One is just having this upfront discussion and saying, we're going to play a horror game. The characters are likely to die, and setting not just the stakes, but the sort of possible outcomes. Because I think, again, if you compare it to something like D&D, where you're effectively superpowered and then your character dies, a lot of people just don't like that. It's very
Mm.
dissatisfying because
If
it,
I could
it
jump in,
betrays their. Yes, yes.
even with D&D, I feel like we need a specific identification or like disclaimer at the beginning of every edition, because each edition plays that very differently. 3.5, it was like level 1 fight the chicken, level 20 dethrone god. In first edition, it was much more the meat grinder that you might expect, say, from a horror game. And then in fifth edition, it's folk heroes doing the right thing and very little death. Maybe one character dies and it's very dramatic in the whole campaign. They're very different ways of telling stories, and yet we don't talk about that in the common. When we think of D&D, we don't ever think of like what the system is then implying for the rest of the story you're telling with it. Just to kind of
Yeah,
piggyback
you're
off of
totally
that net
right.
you were saying.
And on that same note, I imagine, I mean, I feel like we're both excited about a lot of the topics, so we're going to go on tangents. So it is what it is. But you can still very easily have horror experiences in each of those editions too, and just how you accomplish that is different given your player characters' skill sets, and also just sort of like a lot of it is setting and a lot of it is tonal. But we can get to that later. The other safety tool I think is really important and really useful in horror or suspenseful stuff is lines and veils,
Mm.
because right up front. So, for context, for anyone who might not be familiar, lines are subjects or topics or visuals or anything that you explicitly do not want included in your game. These are things, lines that are not to be crossed, right? So very often sexual violence or any kind of more intense things are behind lines. These do not take place in your story. Veils, however, are things that you can have take place, but you do not necessarily describe in detail. This is in a lot of games I've played, this is where gore kind of rests. So you aren't, as a player, getting into vivid descriptions of gore happening, but to go back to like the Friday the 13th, you can say, Jason hits someone with a machete and they're bleeding quite badly. That's
Mm.
totally adequate description. You don't need to get into like what the wound looks like, where the blood splatters. That's sort of like extreme stuff. But having those parameters, especially lines and veils, in my experience, allows you to approach things that are uncomfortable or make players kind of uncomfortable is not the right word, but you get to see where the barriers are of how far your story can push in a particular direction, and then you can get closer to them.
Hmm.
Obviously, with consent of all the players, but you can approach physical violence without, and especially I feel like slashers is not even like the great example of safety stuff here. um, so saying maybe you want mind control or any kind of like brain manipulation to be uh, behind a line, you then know, okay, our villain will not be like a psychic or some kind of
Hmm.
like, you can restrain it, but you're not saying like, oh, I don't want to be made afraid. You're saying this is across the line, but like this is fair game. And
Yeah.
having whether it's a mastered game or a GMless game, just seeing what is on and off limits gives you immediately a tool set to tinker with and kind of explore
Hmm.
what makes people afraid or react more extremely without being insensitive or without being across a line of personal comfort.
Yeah. To add to that, because I've seen this expanded on X card, well, the lines and veils. There's the X card, and there are palettes. So we'll start with palettes. Um, Palettes are the opposite of lines. Palettes are things or themes that you want explored in the story that you think are really cool and everyone agrees on. So you could say, I don't want any psychological horror or like mind control, but I am really cool to explore slasher films and physical violence. I think that'd be interesting to explore in a safe space. And that again helps refine what scenes you'll be structuring as someone who's leading the narrative, but also as everyone getting involved. Everyone at the table, even the players, can be like, right, I know that no one wants mind control, so I'm not going to suggest any plans that have that sort of consequence or effect to them. And equally, they can go, well, I know they like fighting, so I'm going to suggest that we just go in there guns blazing, or something like that. So we can all play into the story that we want to tell. And then something that anyone and everyone can use at the table is the X card. Sometimes it's a physical card with an X on it, or if you're playing online, you just do a big X on your screen, or put the hands up, or any other kind of symbol. But essentially, that's you saying, hey, I, for whatever reason, what we're doing right now doesn't gel with me. Can we walk it back a couple minutes and then go in a new direction? Gloss over it, have a reassess, or whatever. And it's just done without judgment, without having to ask why, unless you want to say, oh, it was this specific element. Could we maybe work around that? And it essentially just normalizes people talking and having good conversations at the table. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the that's a good point. That's one of the more um, useful aspects of safety tools in this like metatextual way, that it just makes it much more okay for you to realize as a as not just a player in a game, but just like as a person, that you can say, I don't like this thing. I don't want to talk about this thing.
Mm.
Um, I think games kind of taught me that culture in a way that I could extrapolate further into just like everyday life, of not having to answer every question that you're asked or every sort of, yeah, it just sort of, like you said, promotes this culture of autonomy, and control over what you are willing and unwilling to discuss.
Of course, I will not rant about this because I could talk about it all day, but I truly believe in all of the good principles and social skills that role playing games of any kind can teach, just because essentially it is, and it's been proven in studies as well, but it is a one step removed way of practicing your social skills. Anything good that happens, people talk about it in a sort of like, I did this, I did that, I saved the day. And anything bad that happens, at least in the story, they talk about, oh, well, my character had something bad happen to them. You have that degree of separation from any failures. And so it's a great way to try out new things, see new viewpoints, explore new ideas, and then incorporate those and use those in the air quotes real world. So I definitely see how these sort of like safety tools are teaching really good personal boundaries, consent skills, and all these other really key important things that we don't necessarily learn in schools in an active way. It's all just passively picked up, or in many cases not. So yeah, role playing games are fab for that.
Um, this sort of segues into something I wanted to talk about too, of just particular examples of games that do suspense really well. And
Mm.
there's specific. So one of my favorite horror games that I've played recently is Quietus by Ollie Jeffries, and in setup, it is a forged in the dark one shot horror game for 2 or 3 players, and one of whom is the game master. So there's a lot already there of just like that deliberate choice, and that isolation is really interesting. But during setup, there's just a series of questions that the GM asks the player or players. And
Mm.
the final one is, what are you most afraid of? Uh, and you can answer as your character or as yourself, or maybe there's crossover there. And this sort of functions, like you said, as a palette of saying, this is a thing that invokes fear or suspense that I'm offering to you, the game master, to then I was going to say weaponize, but that's not quite right. But, to use in the story that will then prompt that fear response in me as a
Mm.
player, or in my character as a player character. Um, I think that question asking system, that game specifically uses all of the safety tools that we mentioned earlier, and that in conjunction with these setup questions works extremely well to go from nothing and in 10-15 minutes have a guided horror experience that all of the involved players are really going to vibe with and probably get creeped out by in like a good way.
Yeah, which is the best way.
Yes.
I think I've also seen really good suspense built up. So that's in a player sense of like, what do you ask the players and how do the players engage in terms of building suspense. Um, I've also found suspense can be built very well when the GM feels confident that they know a lot of information. They know the whole story, they know everything that has happened, and it gives them the confidence to make things up on the spot. I know that I've played games where it should have been suspenseful, but for some reason or the other, the narrator was floundering a little bit. They had to reference things. There were breaks in the flow of the gameplay because they had to go read notes or something like that. And while that's not their fault, it did affect the overall mood and the engagement I was feeling. A game that I have read and played only once, but I want to play it longer and more of it, is Witchburner by Luke Rizik. Ultraviolet Grasslands dude. I will put his link in this video. I know who it is.
Right.
But Witchburner is set in just one village, and it is a very comprehensive book in terms of listing out all of the people who are involved, the general plot, and the very important twist. I'm not so focused on the mechanics that Luca involved in the game, but the general premise and setup. I feel that having read it once, I wouldn't have to look at the book to be able to run the game again. I would refer to it if I needed to for some specific characteristics or something like that, but the idea, the concept, what the feeling that I will be trying to evoke in my players, I kind of get it. And that makes me feel confident, which I feel would then add to this suspense that I'm building, because I know the core truth that I'm building off of, and I know how I can then incorporate the lines, the veils, the palettes in different ways to make sure that suspense builds.
Yeah, I think that touches on another thing in my notes that uh, it is really valuable for building and paying off suspense in games, and that's the known and the unknown. Because here in a GM'd game, the GM knows the thing, the players don't, and eventually they will. I think a lot of successful horror movies really do this well too, of having a threat, establishing that there is a threat without necessarily defining the rules of that threat until later on. Um, I think one of the really great examples that's maybe not like revered historically well is Signs from M. Night Shyamalan, because you as a as the audience and also the characters on the screen never really know what's going on until late in the film. You don't see any aliens. You're just being told that there are aliens, or that there are, things happening that are sort of outside of your explanation. And I think cosmic horror obviously does this in spades, of saying there's something and it's you can't quite see it yet, or you can't quite comprehend this threat, but there is a threat and it is threatening. So again, you're reacting instead of acting, and that balance of information that can be known, because again, like in a role playing game, the players are often trying to figure something out, right? Sometimes, so another example of a horror game that I think it pulls this off really well is one that I made called Cobwebs. I mentioned it earlier. It's a conspiracy horror game, like fiction, like serial podcasts, sort of like Tanis or Limetown, where there's an investigator and they're trying to find a missing person in the game, and they end up finding a deeper conspiracy that maybe threatens their safety. This in the system, which is GM-less, all the players have a note card, and they write down what they think is happening on it, and after every scene, they update that theory. So there ends up being a tug of war amongst all players. So at the beginning of the game, you can only hope to think that what might be going on. By the end of the game, you have a solution that every player contributed to equally, that is different from everyone's beginning theory. So you have this sort of spiraling towards a center solution that every player is pulling in different directions, which was a system in a game called Lovecraft-esque by Becky Aniston and Joshua Fox. I wrote down so I could get credits.
Good.
This working theory that everyone is influencing the final outcome without any one player actually knowing what that outcome is. So it is a really effective and interesting way of maintaining secrets and then revealing those secrets and paying them off in a GM-less way. Because in something like Witchburner, the players won't know the twist and the resolution, but the GM does. And I've found personally, running GM'd games that involve mystery or involve something like that, it's really difficult. You have to be a pretty sharp blade to know when to give clues and when not to, and how explicit the clues are, because so much of that suspense is controlled in the pacing of the story. If the players figure out the solution in 2 scenes, you're going to have a very short game and it's not going to feel very satisfying. But on the opposite end of that spectrum, if you play for 4 hours and you still don't know what to do next, you're also going to be a disgruntled player. And a lot of that information rollout is the responsibility of a game master in a traditional game like that.
I think this is a good time to review some of the things we've talked about and then move on to the next kind of topic that I had, which is traditional storytelling versus tabletop role-playing games, because that segues perfectly in. But so far, I think we've just said that anticipation and suspense is about the loss of agency and then the questioning of how much agency have I regained later on in the story, and am I going to keep that? It's kind of like the initial loss and also the fear of losing more agency and control of the story. And ultimately, the best cases of that are when everyone is on board with the story through safety tools. Everyone is secure, knowing the story isn't going to go somewhere that they are actually could be hurt or harmed by. And so they're ultimately very invested because it's got this safe environment for them to explore these really, really, what could be dark, what could be really kind of like horror elements, or even if it's not a horror game, just a very, very tense standoff it could be a very political game. It could be sword and sorcery. It could be, heroic knights. But because they know generally the vibe of the story and they've laid out things they don't want to happen, they don't have to be on their guard in case those things come up. They can be more open and more engaged with their role play.
Yeah, that's a great summation of a lot of branches on a tree that we went down.
So, moving on to the next branch of the tree, traditional storytelling versus tabletop role playing game storytelling, and building suspense in one is not the same as building in the other. Well, that's my thesis statement. I honestly feel that they're two separate ways of telling stories. I think with traditional storytelling, because you know the linear narrative and you know when you're going to put the story beats in, ultimately you know that your reader, your viewer is going to see things one scene at a time. You get to be ultimate controller of how information is distributed. As you were saying, it so often falls to the storyteller in a kind of like narrator player kind of dynamic of game to have that sharp edge knowing when to release something, when to hold something back, when to have a red herring, when to mislead, and to be able to do that with a bluff face, to do that and not give something away outside of the story by like giggling at making an encounter, like a monster encounter happen, and everyone goes, "Oh, I know this is going to be the dragon. It's going to be really bad." Like all of that, both information reveal and meta information reveal, is important to maintaining the atmosphere. And
Yeah, I
yeah,
think too there are a lot of different like tools available for different forms of media too. Thinking specifically of like Junji Ito's horror manga comics, has this really rewarding and suspenseful tool at the disposal of the physical medium of a book, in that the reader has to turn the page, and turning that page to have a shocking visual or revelation, um, you as the reader are in somewhat this like meta control. You obviously can't control what's going to happen to the character, but you can
mm,
control when you flip the page and you know um, that physical reveal. I think too there's a lot of that in video games, where I'm much more scared by horror video games than I am by horror movies, because my thumbs are moving the character into and out of and around these dangers. So I think one of the many tools specific or used frequently in tabletop is, like you said, the randomization and the dice roll, and that kind of moments of like, oh no, what's going to happen? You know, you're shaking your handful of dice, and upon that drop, there's that pregnant pause of reading the pips or the numerals, and then comparing it to the number that you need to get. It's like fractions of a second, or maybe like a couple seconds
mm-hmm.
tops. But that as a player is extremely suspenseful, and it feels a lot like turning the page of the horror comic. You know that the likelihood that something bad is going to happen is very high, because you're put in this position of physical interaction with your medium. But there's still just the question of what is going to happen, or what could happen if, whether it's success or failure. And obviously that depends a lot on the game and the mechanics involved. But I really like the I think there's a lot of balance, especially in suspenseful role playing, of your character being in suspense and you as a player, and especially like the group. How, you can think of times that you've played a game where someone rolls a dice and everyone like leans over the table and they're like, "Oh my gosh, like let's see what the outcome of this roll is." Whether it
Mm-hmm.
is the boss battle of your dungeon crawl, or the survival roll on something like an alien, um, that meta suspense is really, really valuable. And I think a lot of it then translates into how you role play. So we're gifted by a lot of uh, the forms in which we're interacting to tell stories, comes with this tool, which is randomization, or a game like Dread where you're pulling from a Jenga tower. So you as the
Oh, I
player
can't believe I
holding
didn't even
holding the
bring up
brick.
Dread. I banged on about that game so much in 2019.
I
I
didn't
think
have it in
Dread
my
is one of
notes,
the
but
most
I also can't
amazing.
believe. Yeah,
Why are we not?
I
So
think
on that point of suspense, it doesn't just have to be horror games for this activity of suspense. Suspense is anything for any genre of this sort of what will happen
yes.
next. And I find it so interesting you're talking about the page turn being a key element of the horror genre because it's also a key element of children's book illustration, which is something that I studied at university when I did my illustration degree. The page turn is such an important reveal of the next part of the story, of the resolution of the lost little whale finding their pod, and all this other stuff going on, and also of context. I mean, if we're talking about whales, you might have the entire book focused on how massive these whales are, and then when the little whale gets lost, you turn the page, and then it's massive blue spread, tiny whale, and all it says is one word: alone. And the reveal of information, the context you put it in, is so important to creating that suspense, creating that atmosphere. So, I
Yeah,
think
I think
Dread
too.
is,
There's
yeah, you were gonna
poten-
say?
Sorry, go ahead. I think there's potential even to integrate that theory into design and layout of role playing game books too, um, which is a whole other thing for another time probably. But the
Oh,
idea of you as the information gatherer, whether you're going to be the facilitator of a GM-less game, which is most of my games now are GM-less, which I feel like I should mention because I'm skirting around GM and GM-less in the conversation quite a bit. But even in a GM-less game, typically only not everyone has read the book. So you as the reader are gathering information from the text. If the designer of the game uses those tools and those like theories in the way that the rules text is laid out or that graphics are laid out, you're going to infer those same things as the facilitator, and then you will be able to you might be more inspired to integrate aspects of them into that storytelling or into the way that you role play because you witness it being pushed through the physical medium of the game that you're playing. And I think that's really interesting. I think it's something I've toyed with, but I've never committed to as extremely as something like a comic does or like a children's book does. That because I can picture in my head that spread of the whale and the stark ocean, right, that you described, and it's extremely evocative. Uh, Having that ability to evoke thought and feeling and ideas in a role playing rules text is really interesting. Now that
I
I
think the closest that
am
I
on it,
know of when it comes to
sorry, I have an
design.
example. Sorry,
Oh, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
didn't, didn't mean to speak over you. There's a great game called The Wizards and the Wastes by Bats, and it's effectively a Howl's Moving Castle role playing game. And the way that the text is laid out on the page really does a lot of these things. Like um, there will be a page. I wish I didn't pack all my books for moving because there's so many great examples that used to just be right there. There will be a page about like spirits and how you can tame spirits. The idea, for those who've seen the movie, like the fire spirit that's kind of contained in the furnace of the home,
Mm-hmm.
who is like owed something but also like demands something. Anyway, there's like really loose mechanics in the rule book for that, but the way that the text is arranged, sometimes there will be stuff like written in a spiral about demons or spirits, and just the act of physically like turning my book like this to read that line of text is in itself an evocative experience that like or having text be upside down or written on top of itself in like kind of messy ways. Those evoke feelings that I think a lot of games and physical media rely on illustrations and that sort of stuff to accomplish. I mention it more so the idea that you can use these tools and tricks to get the reader in the vibe, in the mood, and you don't necessarily have to be an illustrator or have graphic design education to pull those things off.
Mm. I see. I think this is to the credit of design or not having those like traditional professional skills. I work for the. I'm actually wearing the shirt. I work for the Edinburgh Zine Library, and so I've got this. Just wear it today. But zines in general, if you want to get some ideas for cool role playing game design and page design, just go to a zine library, look up zines online, and just see some of the cut and stick things that people have done and the layouts they've done with stamps, with found images, and everything, all the different textures they use. It's very inspiring. I don't think you have to have a professional eye, air quotes there, to create some really gripping and beautiful work, especially if you're working just with text. You can definitely do some interesting things just on its own. Um, Lost my trail of thought there. So,
I think. Sorry, I think you were going to say something about dread. Uh, I don't know if that helps jog the thought.
well, I was going to say, going back to the sort of conversation of traditional straight narrative of you have a series of events, you know how people are going to read them, and how tabletop role playing games are different. Ultimately, in tabletop role playing games, you might have a collection of scenes that you have prepared, but you don't know in what order they will be revealed, what people will see first, what direction they'll go in. And so I want to talk a little bit about building suspense with building blocks as opposed to knowing your whole narrative. So I mean, like an example of that, of approaching something in a single traditional story sense and it not going well, would be when you say with a game where you know everything, you've got that twist. The players get 2 hours in and they figured it out, and you've got another 2 hours to fill, and you don't know how to stretch it, and it's just like, ugh, this is awkward. It's like they've gone to the last page, read it, and gone, oh, that's who the murderer is.
All
So,
right.
uh, what do you think is a good way of taking building blocks and constructing them to make a suspenseful narrative, or how are ways that you can do that? What sort of things do you like to prepare?
So one example that comes to mind quickly, and this is maybe not a game that is like expected in conversation with horror and suspense, but Fiasco by Jason Morningstar uh, is effectively like a Coen Brothers movie generator. So you're usually people who are in a gray morality, um, and it's generally like focused around a crime or some kind of illegal activity. Um, and the game takes place in the setup. You have, well, there's a new edition that has cards and stuff. I haven't played it.
Hmm.
I imagine it works very similarly. Uh, in the original edition, you had dice that basically big pool, and you would help establish relationships between each of the player characters and like locations and items and stuff. So I really liked this system of saying, oh, you and I, we used to go to college together, and you hang out at the local diner all the time. And then in the center of the table, we have like a briefcase with $100,000 inside. And so you have kind of these Legos of story chunks, and you don't elaborate them on them during setup. You do it during role playing. So you might have an idea for why that briefcase has $100,000 in it, but someone else might on their turn give some sort of answer or solution for that briefcase, and then
Hmm.
you're sort of piggybacking on this creative energy together to take all of these Legos and build together your story. So I think a tool that's useful is having some kind of uh, requisite toolkit or list of things. This is a little bit more specific, but similar idea to lines and veils and palettes, saying these are the things that we have available, these are the things that we are not going to use, and then making sense of them, putting them together, and seeing what kind of shape it creates over the course of play. This also reminds me of something. I do a game design theory podcast called The Brain Trust with my friend Will Yobst. And we had talked recently about tricks that movies and TV shows use to do this sort of thing that gaming doesn't, or in theory can't, but like we explore the idea that maybe it can. One of the things being a trailer. Uh, I got really into watching like grindhouse trailers, like really bad schlocky 70s horror stuff around Halloween. And these trailers are so interesting because they either it was a trend in like the 70s to either have like a 4-minute trailer that just tells you everything about the movie and you still
Mm.
want to see it, or you have like a 30-second trailer that's just like clips of violence or shock, and then just like the title of the film. And we were playing with the idea that like you could make a trailer for the story that you're going to do, and you basically then are creating these bullet point things of saying like, and I think a lot of those schlocky trailers do a great job too of saying like they might show a slasher with an axe and bringing it down on the football player, but then in the actual film, like you see the football player just evade the axe just barely. So
Mm.
the trailer almost like misleads you. So effectively, you role play a trailer. Maybe you say you have 4 players and each of you gets to give two, one, two, three, four, 1, 2, 3, 4 moments that will take place in your story, and then over the session of role playing, you introduce them. Maybe you write them on note cards so you have them available, you don't forget them. But the idea that you could use these tools that movies use, or in a TV show when they cut to commercial and they say like coming up after the commercial, here's this.
Mm.
They're tools that I think are interesting, and they get you as an audience member to continue to be excited, right? Or in the case of a movie, to buy into the complete story. Um, it's interesting to theorize that because in a role playing game, you are the audience, the actors, the directors, everyone involved, you still want to entertain that audience, right? So you're kind of escaping from your own lens through which you're interacting with the story to make, again, like a trailer, a teaser, something like that, have these moments that you plant, and then later you get to reap them, and they might be different than you initially pictured, but they're still they're more specific than like a palette, but saying I want to see the slasher attack the football player uh,
Mm.
in a more narrative way, instead of saying like this is an event that I want to happen. You get to describe it. You get to talk about the camera work and what happens, but you just have a couple seconds to do so.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really fun, really interesting way, and I think it's something that I haven't seen games do or approach. Um,
I think
because
when we're
again, I
talking
think
about, just to
sorry,
add to that,
I was yep. Go ahead.
um, that works with the flexible requirements of a role-playing game. Linear narrative, it's just all the blocks are laid out. With this sort of like trailer system, because you have the flexibility of how you get there, you still get to curate these awesome moments and have them kind of coming along and everyone knows they're going to happen. But as you said, you have that curiosity of how will we get there? And it comes back to that, will we have the agency to change this? We know this threat is coming, but we don't know what it will look like. It will help build anticipation. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, again, I think that balance of player knowledge and player character knowledge is interesting to play with, and I think a lot of players, or a lot of more trad games and more traditional story informed players, they fear that, like, right, you don't want to have your story spoiled, or you want everything to have this kind of like pure mystery to it. But I don't think that's necessarily valuable, or it's maybe riskier in situations where um, all the players are like wanting outcome or events, but they're in secret, right?
I
Like I
would
might want that attack to happen, but if I don't explicitly say it, or there's sort of the idea that the game takes place in like natural momentum, and it's fueled by everyone's knowledge of story arcs and how narratives are formed, in addition to your ability to improvise and role play. I think that it's less of a dirty word than people think to just say like these are the things that I want to happen, or these are the things that are going to happen in the event of a trailer, and context might reshape them. But I think that stuff is really interesting, and I also think it helps uh, carry some of that burden of that narrative structure, because again, a lot of games were emulating movies, were emulating TV ways, and books, every way of telling a story. Every player has whatever their relationship is with storytelling, and through role playing in some way you're trying to recreate that and trying to capture that lightning in a bottle. I think it's valuable to have tools at hand that make that narrative better. And I think it's a fallacy to think that you're betraying some aspect of the narrative by being explicit about those things, or spoiling surprises. I think revealing those moments or having those bullet points take place in your story is rewarding, whether you saw it coming or not.
I have an example and a game I want to talk about. So I'm going to start with the example, and it very much reinforces and goes for this trailer system. I have a live show, Beast Fables, which is sort of playing as little animals in a big forest. And we had an interlude, a few episodes where not all of our players could make it. And so I just played with one player, separate character in a different part of the world, to set up some themes that would be coming on in the main game. And it had a very dramatic effect on the campaign. Specifically for planning that game, it is all about a hare that is a bounty hunter. They go into this town to do something and then leave. And when I was talking with the player, Ver, about this, the very first thing I said was, in this game, that city is going to burn down. I don't know how it will happen. You don't know why it's going to happen, but it will burn down. And just that beginning, that anticipation that Ver had, it just set the scene for everything we then developed from there. It set the pacing of the story, and it made it so satisfying to play. Because we knew that something bad was going to happen, it helped build that anticipation. And like that trailer, because we knew it was on the cards, we knew when we wanted to reveal things to make things more dramatic for the audience. So the audience didn't necessarily know that was coming, but as the player, we did, and we were able to then lean into that and have fun with it. But then also something unexpected, which is that trailer effect you're talking about, that sort of, things are happening and they're going to come, but you don't know how. We introduced a lot of themes in that interlude. All the players have seen the interlude and watched it, or be as if you were there, you were there. And so when we're playing in the main game now, there are all these things happening in the back of the player's head that the characters don't know, and that is building tension and anticipation for what will come and how it will look when it does arrive. Which is so fun, and it's not something I expected, but I'm glad that we have.
Yeah, I think that's great. Similarly, to use the alien example too, you start that movie, you see there's however many people on the ship, and the movie's called Alien. You know that they're not all going to survive. You as an audience member just know that. And so it's not disappointing to you when characters start getting killed because you expected it. But and in a lot of ways, you would be more disappointed if everything just went perfectly, right? Because the movie gives you these expectations of this is how the story will probably go. I think this trailer system offers that parallel to a game and saying this is what's going to happen. So buckle up. It kind of goes back to some degree that just like getting on the same page at the start of a story kind of safety, when we were talking about safety tools. It's just saying, like, if you have a game where every player character but one is going to die, and that one player is going to be the final girl, you go into it and you play, you enjoy that, the story that emerges, even knowing that your player, or your character rather, is probably going to die. That's not a loss. That is a win for the greater functional collaborative narrative. And I think with a lot of horror stuff, it's expected in the buy-in, especially as I mentioned with like slasher stuff or cosmic horror. You know that it's unlikely that everyone's going to get out fine, and that's not disappointing to you. That's part of the coolness. That's part of why you're doing that game. So I think having trailers, having those moments, those interludes, those post credit, those all are super effective in choosing up players and like you said, getting their minds thinking in ways that they might not otherwise, as long as they're just going from day to day in character. And it will also then kind of ramp up your collective narrative, and you have a lot of like excitement, a lot of anticipation for those moments to come. And that, I think, when we go back to the earlier subject of what is suspense, I think that is one of the most effective ways of getting players to feel suspense instead of just their characters and acting like you are in suspense.
I love that. Yeah, all of that. It's just a good way of building it. I also wanted to talk about a little self plug. My Kickstarter going on right now, Vice and Virtue. It's all about building anticipation and suspense. So one way of building anticipation is this sort of trailer system that I'm actually not really excited to see what you come out with when it happens, because that's sort of about at the very beginning of the game establishing a bunch of points. Vice and Virtue is a balance of examining character morals after a scene in your story has happened, but also establishing something about that scene when it starts. Sort of like a chapter title. I think I read a lot of fantasy, and I actually really love it when they have a chapter title, because I feel, again, like a trailer, it sets something up, it sets an expectation that will be subverted, or maybe it won't, and it builds that anticipation. In Vice and Virtue, at the start of every scene, which is just a segment of story, it can be any length of actual time in the game, but just in a scene, the players pick from 3 fortunes. A fortune is a cryptic clue about something that will happen in that scene, and it's linked to content that the narrator has prepared. So the narrator, the person running the game and telling the story, they have 3 scenes that they're ready to go with, and they have bits of world building, prompt, whatever they need to help bud that scene from nothing. And they each have a fortune tied to it. And it is so fun, the actual act of putting the fortunes in front of the players and then asking them to choose and discuss why they want to choose which fortune, what they think is interesting, especially when those fortunes themselves are so dramatic. Stuff like Under Stone and Into Death's Domain and Horse Their Cries Fill the Night, and very, very dramatic ideas like that. I like a literal link between the fortune and the actual events of the story so that it feels grounded and not just dramatic, but I also like subverting it as well and really playing with how that anticipation will then come out and what will be revealed in the story. I think with the trailers, it's fun because you know what's coming, but you don't know how it will come. And I think that same aspect with the fortunes, it's anticipation building for the players because they're choosing one, but it's also exciting for the narrator because they get to see and hear what the players are excited and afraid about. In that sense of drawing lines and palettes, you get to hear what they're sort of curiously, almost morbidly excited with in the fortunes. They go, oh god, what if this means there's going to be a raid? Are we going to be prepared for that? And that might not be the content that's prepared for the scene, but if you're reflective and reactive, it almost gives you fodder to then pad things or change the story or make it more complex as you go along.
Right. I think too, because in Vice and Virtue, these fortunes are presented as cards, correct? Uh, they have this subjective nature to it that the players don't have perfect information, right? They're being offered these fortunes, but they're having to infer what that fortune might mean for their player or for their character, and that inference can be wrong, or like you said, that inference could plant seeds that maybe it wasn't the intended direction or something that was considered, but can be adapted by the narrator to include those inferences. And it's something I play with a lot in a lot of my games, most specifically in Necronautilus, the game that's about to be released. Just the idea of this word or this picture might mean something to one player that's very different and distinct from the meaning inferred by another player. And that super excites me as a player, especially as a game designer, to offer someone to say, here's a card with a horse on it and a lightning strike in the background, and like, what do you think that means? It is another system by which you get to explore people's thought processes and people's creativity in this system of role playing that just really is a fascinating exploration on creativity and subjectivity and the way that we work together, but the way that we find different meaning in different symbols and stuff.
Yeah. I don't know what I think. It's a lot to digest there. I like the exploration of how characters think, how players think, and how players think their characters are acting, and at opening that discussion to other people as well. Vice and Virtue has a reflection aspect at the end of every scene where then you discuss the actions that have occurred and how people have acted, what that means for their characters, and how they grow with that information. And that reminds me of at the end of like action films and horror films, they always have that sort of like, you think you've defeated the bog monster, but then the final frame, there's the hand rising out of the mud again. Is it really gone? I like this idea of anticipation then building itself up again after a reflection. You have that rise, the tension of the scene, the payoff, that debrief, and then that sort of building of tension again, but even more so because you now know things or become aware of how much you don't know. I think it's interesting to build. Well, I'm going to put this out there. When do you think the bubble pops? When do you think you've got so much suspense that it just caves? They know so much that either the suspense just dies off and it peters out, or equally the suspense can't grow anymore and the payoff won't ever be good enough. Is there too much suspense in a game?
Sure, I think a lot of maintaining that suspense and having a valuable payoff comes from pacing of your story, which I think it has to be, well, not has to. I think generally it works better if the pacing is faster. I think one of the things that often kills that payoff is having the players hit pause and discuss, what's going to happen next or what is our next plan of attack. Not necessarily because those are valuable conversations to have, especially again in more trad games where the idea is like that your player characters are the heroes and that you need to win. Tactical investments are valuable, but I think that's when you get into stalling, and that suspense is really difficult to carry over. So then, if I'm running a game like that, that's when I interrupt with more action. So if they take a breath, they say, "What happens now?" That's when the axe cleaves through the door, and they're put once again into this situation where they're reacting instead of acting. The power differential needs to always, not always, but generally be in the favor of the thing that is threatening them, to maintain the idea that they are under threat. Because as soon as they become the force with an upper hand, the suspense is less present because the stakes have shifted. So I think it's valuable to maintain that the characters are on their heels, because that will just make if there is a showdown in which the characters are meant to or find some clever way to defeat the threat, that defeat or that victory for them is going to feel really immense. Or in the inverse, if they're not supposed to, not that you're supposed to or not supposed to, but certain games favor the player characters, certain games favor the threats. In the event that the threat is kind of unconquerable or unlikely to be conquered, you just need to keep the players in check of that, not let them get the idea that the type of game where you are going to be the hero. And so yeah, managing expectations I think is the other aspect, and I think a lot of that again comes up front during setup and during establishment of what you're doing. Um, as for building tension too long, I'm not. Obviously, it is possible, but I think just by the nature of again how players uh, integrate their knowledge of how stories work, even in the event of this sort of doomed character games where you know that you're going to die, it's just not fun necessarily to hide in the closet. You kind of want to you innately want to have the story hit those beats. So to some extent, it relies on the player to acknowledge and come to terms with the end goal of the game itself and what their role is in accomplishing that goal. And then in a game that has a game master, I think the game master just turns up the heat when things start to cool down. And as long as it's always moving in a direction, uh, it's unlikely, I think, that it will just sort of never pay off or just get to a point where suspense is kind of desensitized.
Yeah. I think that does nicely cover those points. It just sort of summarizes. Yes. Okay. So moving on from there, I kind of had a way of rounding off our talk about suspension, or suspense and anticipation. Suspension is slightly different, more structural. Was go-to techniques for creating tension at the table. So I think I'll start by saying one way of having, because you said, if you get to a quiet moment and they feel secure, having that axe plunge through the door is a nice way of like adding that action back in. I'd say something I like to go to is the unknown consequence of an action they've previously taken. If your characters in the story have gained a lot of agency, they're feeling very powerful, they're feeling very sure, I like to then subvert that agency by revealing, because I like morally grey games, by revealing some negative aspect to having that control. For example, in one of the stories, we in Beast Fables, these little animals have to fight a snake. They have to try and get around and away from it. And one of these players takes out a lens and blinds it with this glass lens they've got. And then a couple games later, I say, oh, well, they've just defeated this bad guy. You smell smoke on the wind. And as it turns out, a couple sessions ago, they started a wildfire, but obviously had run away. They had no idea what was happening. And then the next big threat they had, that cleaver through the door, was, well, you've got to, realize that you may have won the battle, but now you've got this wildfire going on. You have to escape it. And also, you've got this looming tense threat of, we're going to have to deal with the fact there's been a wildfire. We're going to have to deal with all the consequences that will come away from that. You've got the guilt of the action, but also the anticipation of what have we got to deal with next because of this. So you don't have to prevent players from getting agency in the story, but you can add complications from having that agency.
Yeah, I think that works really well. I was going to say doing camera cuts or using dramatic irony where the audience sees something that the characters don't see. In this case, if you have the characters escape the snake encounter, and then at the end of your session, you say, the camera cuts back, you see the snake slithering into darkness, and in the sort of dry grass that in its wake, you see these embers start to spark, right? So you have, again, this information that you as players know and the characters themselves will find out later. I think that works nicely to build tension because, again, you're planting seeds that will grow into something later. But then your players know that and they get to react to that. So in a more horror thing, like you said, when the creature reaches its hand up after you think that you've bested it, is or in a less intense way, it's sort of like a mid story thing. Just having the camera cut away from its focus on your player characters and showing something that's happening in the world outside. Maybe this is, the slasher goes to the gas station to get supplies and just destroys the gas station attendant. This was maybe not a character in your story. The gas station maybe was not a location, but now the threat has a gas can, and you all know that. So like, it adds to, again, this playing with tools that are more commonly used in movies and TV that we're all familiar with, to the extent that they're often tropes. And I think people think that that's a dirty word, a dirty tactic, but I think that they are really fun and useful when you get to use them in your story. So a go-to tactic of mine to sum up that thought is cutting away from player action to show something, to light a fuse somewhere else.
Are there other go-to tactics that you like to enjoy?
One of my favorites is just, especially in a GM-less game, just having something that no one can know. The theory system from Lovecraft-esque and from Cobwebs, it has been one of the most effective tools I've seen of having this really neat payoff that everyone feels like they've contributed to, but no one could have saw coming. I think similarly, the tilt in Fiasco, which is the midpoint of your session where you roll a bunch of dice and there is like an event that happens, whether something blows up or someone gets killed, or there's this pivotal thing, thinking of the game as kind of a seesaw, and the whole thing has just been knocked. I think those systems in GMless games specifically, of introducing an important aspect after play has begun, whether it's from a dice table, whether it's a random draw of a card, whether it's inferred information from things that you've established through your story. I think those are really great for later story suspense, or this is where twists takes place. This is where like big reveals, like like if you don't know who the big bad guy is, you just know that there is a threat, and then 3/4 of the way through your story, they make themselves known. I think those are things that happen a lot in movies that are really hard to pull off in games, especially if you don't have a game master. But those games specifically mentioned do a pretty cool job of that. So it's harder. It's sort of the thing that it's not necessarily GM advice. It's more designer advice of building in systems to your greater system that allow for secrets to kind of come during the actual gameplay. That's one of my favorite things.
To actively, as part of its construction, to guide the tension to build, to give you points to be like, right, I know when I'm going to do this, and to make that a part of the game so that you don't have to try and shove it in or find a place to cram it. You actively have a space for that. I think
expecting players to come up with that on their own is a big ask, especially a lot of games again try to take for granted the player knowledge of how stories are formed. So building that into your storytelling system and having it innately be something that just happens, whether it is again like dice prompted or player event prompted or whatever, having that consideration in the design stage will make playing it feel very painless, and that payoff is kind of built into the structure of how the game is played.
I think to sort of add to that, for games that don't have a system in place that actively encourages that, just being aware of the cultural cues that your players are aware of and the people you're playing with are aware of, and then leaning into those or being upfront about them can also help build tension. So, for example, a very, very common trope in video games is the final save point. You always get that fatherly figure come in and say, this is the last time you can save and buy stuff before you go on, finish up any business before you do this quest, or something like that. And I think knowing that as a cultural cue, if you know that your friends play those sorts of games, taking those tropes and having them be frank discussions, either as like the characters are saying, well, this is the final chance before we assault the castle, or equally as a GM being like, I'm going to be going towards wrapping the story up. This is our last chance to review anything before we go forward. Being upfront about the direction of the story will help build that anticipation and that excitement. It also then helps relieve any disappointment there could be if you were, as a player, weren't aware that, say, the campaign was going to be ending, or that this arc was going to stop, to then get to that episode and be like, right, that's it, big bad's dead, the end. And they go, oh, but I thought we had so much more time to go. I thought, if the movie ended halfway through and there was credits for an hour and a half, that would also be a bad payoff. That signal of where you are in the story is good for building that anticipation, and it doesn't require you to have a mechanic in place to do that. It just requires good communication skills, and actively knowing the language you're using when you're talking to your players in terms of like those cultural cues.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. Obviously, if a game has it built in, that's easy. But a lot of games don't. So I think it goes back to the idea that the like purity of your role playing is not as paramount as you think it is. Having the GM tell you, the players, things that are happening or things that could happen. They're not spoilers. They're actually there to enhance the way that you role play and enhance the story as a whole. I think that understanding will reward everyone involved with a more pleasurable story experience.
And honestly, I feel like my final closing thought on this whole discussion is that I know that they are called tabletop role playing games, but I always think of them as storytelling games. And when I think of something in the frame of this is a storytelling game, when I'm explaining rules, when I am making mechanics, when I'm making characters, I'm thinking about ultimately what everyone wants, which is a good story. When I think of role playing games, more and more I feel that just restricts it to this idea of you are the character and this is single decisions. If you think of it as a storytelling game, it makes everything so much more enjoyable because you're all building something together. Whether you're a narrator and players, whether it's a collaborative group, I think that helps frame the tools we use, and also helps dispel a lot of the, how to say it, you were saying that dirty word feeling of like, it's not a spoiler, it's just us telling a good story together. I think that's my closing thought to this sort of anticipation discussion.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a good summation. I think that collaborative nature, that like hive mind creativity that comes from these games, is one of my favorite parts of playing and writing them. So anything you can do to enhance that, again, the idea of us over I, will make everyone's entertainment better, everyone's experience a higher level.
I also think it takes some of that pressure off. Just like the thought popping into my brain, it takes the pressure off of individuals as well. Because a lot of the time in, say, a trope that is in the community is that the narrator is the one who is writing the story, preparing the world, and making all the stuff, and they're the entertainer, and the player's just along for the ride. But when we're all thinking of it as a storytelling game, then the players know that it's also a responsibility of theirs to be part of that storytelling process, to be engaging and to have those conversations with the narrator, but also with themselves, and to make all of this flow and work. And it takes some of that pressure off of the narrator. It shares the load, which is cool.
Yeah, yeah. From having played trad games and moved into more indie games, anything that can relieve some of that responsibility or share the weight is very welcome. um, I mean, four people carrying a table together is going to just work, well, literally and figuratively, as this is tabletop gaming. But I was talking about a real table. Four people are going to have an easier time carrying it because the weight is distributed equally. So extrapolating that to the figurative of four people carrying your table to Storyland, you'll all benefit from it. I mean,
I just love
people are your friends
I
too.
love it.
You know, you don't want to hurt the one person who's expected to carry the table, right? Like you got to help them. So
Mm-hmm. So I feel the best way to kind of conclude everything is probably just to do a quick cliff notes of the stuff we've discussed.
Sure.
So we started with what is anticipation. So anticipation is the starting with agency, the loss of it, the gaining of it, and then the fear of continuing to lose it in the story felt by the players. It is for players best achieved when everyone is on the same table, established through safety tools, so everyone can be secure in the fact that the story isn't going to go somewhere they're uncomfortable, and equally is going to go somewhere that they are excited to see. That excitement then helps build the anticipation, this loss of agency, because they can trust that no matter how much agency they lose, the story isn't going to go somewhere unsafe. And equally, they are excited to see what happens when they lose control of the story for various reasons. Um,
Yeah, that's a lot more succinct than I think I would have been able to make happen.
so that's what is suspense. Good building of suspense. I think we were talking about how good suspense is. My brain has
I
gone
think
blank.
so. I'll try this one.
Yeah, go
Good
for it.
suspense manages player expectation with fulfillment of those expectations. Um, as managed again by safety tools and also as managed by game mechanics and our shared knowledge of story structure, um, the ability to plant seeds and uh, foster them creatively and narratively to successful payoffs makes for entertaining suspense and not
Hmm.
necessarily just for the sake of building tension for a weaker payoff. That
Mm-hmm.
integration of story structure and collaborative creativity for the sake of a greater story result is good suspense.
And leading on from that, generating suspense isn't just the story itself, but it's also in the mechanics of how you are telling that story. And it can also be in the materials behind or the materials used to represent those mechanics. We talked a little bit about the physicality of rules books. You gave the example of Wizards in the Waste by Bats, did you say?
Yes.
I will have a link for all the stuff we've mentioned in the description, but with that, the layout of the page, the spinning and reading of text as it spirals, being a way of engaging players and in the game by having those activities they do, how and I will extrapolate this, how props can help build tension, how giving something over to the player as a handout can build tension because it is a new form of stimulus, a new way of interacting. Layouts and how we present information can build that anticipation. It doesn't just have to be a specific way of telling a story. It doesn't have to be a specific mechanic. It's the composite of all of these things that build immersion and build suspense. And when it comes to building suspense, it's not about making a linear story and then knowing when to reveal it. It's being flexible to the way the story could go. It is okay to have set scenes or to preview stuff like with this trailers system or with Vice and Virtue, so long as you maintain that flexibility and that agency on the player's side to kind of choose where the story's going but still be surprised by the outcome, to have things subverted, or even to be shocked when everything they thought is true and it's worse than they imagined. And then I think we rounded up the final techniques that we
Cool.
just love to use. My technique. What did I even say my technique was? Oh, it's getting late here in the UK. Was consequences. Unexpected consequences that you build up from actions. So, that wildfire. And again, using that preview, letting the players know that something is coming, having the anticipation of that thing in the horizon coming closer, and then the dramatic irony of the characters in the story not knowing that it's coming. That cutaway that they would use in cinemas. Your favorite go-to was
uh,
Handover.
well, probably make my go-to for paying off suspense is the shared secret, or having information mechanically structured in the game, or if using systems like Vice and Virtue, integrating those systems after play has begun, to continue to build and wonder about and then reveal secret information to the players that was not available to them at the preset of the game. So not things that take place during setup, but things that happen 50, 75% of the way through the story that offer twists and reveals and shock, and ultimately pay off a greater meta suspense shared by the players, that then ramps up the excitement and the sort of finale feeling of your story.
Yeah. This has been a really fantastic discussion, dude. This has been really fun.
Yeah. Yeah, this was great.
So,
I feel like it's a similar feeling to when we do the podcast of like, I think I know what we're going to talk about, but then through the act of talking about it, I was like, oh yeah. And like,
and
you
that's,
have new ideas. You have how to integrate that into future work. Like, that's really great.
I definitely agree. I like making little headers because then most times when I do like podcasts like this, I'll be like, we'll be talking and we'll talk about so much stuff, and I'll look back at this list of topics and I'm like, oh, we've already done like 3 of these, and there's one at the end. Well, we've done that, so we're gonna have to shift, and then it's fun. It's fun to see what we cover, what links where, and get those unexpected connections between topics. I think
right.
We should just round off
to the structure of our conversation.
The meta discussion, how to build suspense in your podcasts. I think we'll just round up by reintroducing ourselves and plugging anything we've got going on. So, Adam, I'll let you go first.
Sure. Once again, my name is Adam Vass, and I operate in the tabletop design sphere as World Champ Game Co. I am currently publishing and distributing Necronautilus, a science fantasy game about the subjectivity of language, memory, and reality in a universe where everything goes when it dies. I also release monthly games in print at patreon.com/worldchampgameco. And my main hub, where everything lives, is worldchamp.io.
Is there a place where you can pre-order Necronautilus as well?
The pre-orders I actually just closed. They were on BackKit, but I will by the time this airs, I think I'll have them in my store, which again is worldchamp.io/store, because I'll be fulfilling them to Kickstarter backers within the next couple weeks.
Wow, that is incredible. Well, thank you so much for being on Working on a Dime. That's the name of my show. I have been Brian Tyrrell. I steal that past tense from Ver. Ver's always like, on my other show, Ver's like, I have been Ver. And I say it every time because it's so cool. I need to stop saying it.
Yeah,
I am Brian Tyrrell. I use he, him pronouns. I run Dungeons on a Dime. You probably know what that is if you're watching this on my channel, but it's a role-playing company, publisher imprint thing. I make entry-level role-playing supplements, games, adventures, and content in general. My Kickstarter, Vice and Virtue, is on Kickstarter, surprisingly, as opposed to somewhere else. It's live right now until the 5th of December. It's over 200% funded, and hopefully will remain to be 200% funded when this airs. If it's not, that would be embarrassing, but it's totally fair. And it is all about moral roleplay. It is tarot-inspired, fortune-telling inspired, and it is a really fun Kickstarter. You can read all of the rules for free via the Kickstarter as well. They are fully written and edited by Vi Huntsman, who is my editor, who is great, and I love them. They're just so good to work with. And there is more to come. We've just got the goal for gold foil cards, and the next goal I have, which is at £3,000, will be guest writers coming in to write bits of fortunes and content for the game. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. We've all got to cover. I will say goodbye, and thank you so much, Adam, for being on my podcast.
Yeah, thanks again for inviting me. It was great.
I'll see you all soon.